everyone, welcome to GlideFast On Air. I'm Lauren Jankowski, the Marketing Manager here at GlideFast, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, answering the age-old question, Flow Designer or Workflow Editor. I'm excited to introduce to you your presenters for today. David Arbor, a Senior Architect at GlideFast, and Matt Dumont, an Architect here at GlideFast. Before we get started, I'd like to give you some background information on GlideFast. GlideFast Consulting is a consulting firm that is dedicated exclusively to ServiceNow. As an Elite ServiceNow Partner, our expert team of developers and architects have worked on both sides of the table, on the customer side and the consulting side. Our company was founded by ServiceNow architects, and we're proud to have a team of over 100 experienced consultants, an average CSAT score of 9.6, and many more accolades, as you can see here. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout today's session, so please send in any questions as they arise, and we'll do our best to answer them. As another perk of attending today's webinar, we'll be giving away a $50 Visa gift card. We'll announce the winner of that at the end of today's session. Now, I'd like to hand things over to Matt and David.
Thanks, Lauren. All right, so let me start out by outlining a few questions we'd like to help answer today. What is Flow Designer? You've probably heard a lot about it, but may not be aware of what it was designed to accomplish, a no-code alternative to solve common service problems. Today, we're going to go over some of the benefits of Flow Designer and how it can potentially solve that problem for your company. What can I begin to transition to Flow Designer? ServiceNow manages a lot of process flows in a lot of places. What are some things that make sense to transition from those places into Flow Designer? And last, when do I use Workflow Editor? Flow Designer was not intended to replace Workflow Editor. And there are a few types of flows that we think still make more sense than Workflow Editor. We'll go ahead and provide those examples and some more detail later on. So first, let's go over some of the benefits of Flow Designer. It's designed to consolidate multiple Now Platform automation capabilities, as well as configuration and runtime information into a single environment. With the addition of no-code flow design and integration hub, repeatable automations can be tracked and logged in one place. I'm sure some of you have experienced the headache of code and log entries spread across the entire environment. And many of us have probably at some point designed some form of custom application to work around this. It also provides natural language descriptions of flow logic, which goes back to that low-code, no-code philosophy. It enables subject matter experts to develop and share reusable actions. This is a feature that I think most developers can get behind, at least to some extent, as it allows more granular delegation of development to the teams in charge of particular processes while maintaining a level of security and control over the code base. It also reduces upgrade costs with upgrade-safe Now Platform logic, replacing complex custom script. While it can replace some script, we will point out later in David's portion of the presentation that this may not always be the case for some more complex scripts, and we may not recommend necessarily using it for a really complex code base as well. It's also designed to reduce development costs by providing a library of reusable actions. Again, this is true of the flow actions we will discuss later, and can be extremely helpful for companies that wish to take a more distributed development approach to their ServiceNow development. It enables Flow Designer extension by way of integration or installing spokes. We won't dig too much into this, into Integration Hub, as it's not part of the out-of-the-box platform. It is an additional cost, but I would recommend that you talk to your account manager about whether this library of external spokes is right for your company. And last, but certainly not least, it is able to call Workflow Editor flows. And this is pretty key for the discussion that we're going to have, because as we go into what makes sense of Flow Designer versus Workflow Editor, you can always keep in the back of your mind that even if something seems to fit better in Workflow Editor, you can still front end a workflow with the Flow Designer and trigger workflows anywhere in that process. So just keep that in your pocket while we go through this. Now, for those who aren't already familiar with Flow Designer, I would like to briefly summarize the major components before we dig in to where it makes sense to use it. The basic flow is pretty simple. The flow is triggered, and this can be by a variety of things, including emails, scheduled jobs, record updates, etc. And those options are expanding as new releases come out. A condition determines under what circumstances that trigger should generate a new flow event. then the actions, which are highly flexible and can be maintained by developers in a separate code base, get triggered throughout the process. These make reusable, these are reusable and available to the app owners while maintaining security. So we'll dive into that a little bit later on, but the reusability of the actions is a strong point of Flow Designer, because you can design a set of work and create an action around it and then distribute it to various teams and have them use those within their flows. Executions allow you to monitor each flow and view its progress. Flow Designer has a contained set of logs that make tracking down flow errors a lot easier. And then lastly, the data panel auto-populates with all of the data that you pull into the flow, plus extended glide record information about those items. A lot of what you would normally have to retrieve in a workflow via script about records that you're trying to update or to modify, or just pulling in information through glide record queries, a lot of that's pre-populated as soon as you retrieve that record within the Flow Designer. As you can see, the basic composition of Flow Designer is a compact interface intended to be user-friendly. And that's going to be a running theme with Flow Designer, that it's a way to simplify a lot of the work that you would do with Workflow Editor for reusability purposes and for redistribution and packaging of code. So this is the ServiceNow slide for training on the Flow Designer that talks about when ServiceNow believes you could use Flow Designer. And later on, we'll be covering some of the cases where you might not want to use Flow Designer, at least not in the current state. It starts with, are you running Kingston or newer? Because Flow Designer and Integration Hub were introduced around this time. You obviously can't use it if it doesn't exist yet, so that's a pretty important question to ask before trying to use a flow instead of a workflow. For versions beyond that, these questions become relevant. Is your trigger a create, read, update, delete table operation or schedule? I would add the caveat that that's actually, that base of triggers is being expanded with new releases. So this question may expand depending on what version you're on. And you might have other ways that you could trigger a flow. So that question has to be reevaluated. The other question is, are all the steps and actions that you need in the Flow Designer? This depends a lot on what components you own as far as Integration Hub and Flow Designer, but it's also another expanding base of actions because each version releases new opportunities and new actions, and you can create your own custom ones as well. So that's something that you are constantly evaluating in your environment. Excuse me. And then lastly, does your logic include if-then branching or a linear flow? We'll later share some examples of why that question is very important to ask yourself before implementing a designer flow. And rather than address that here, we'll actually show some examples of different cases. So this next slide is to address a question I actually asked myself when Flow Designer was first released. Is Flow Designer just a fancy business rule? I contend that it adds a few more features that are pretty handy. So this just does a quick comparison between the two. Business rules are server-side script triggered by CRUD operations on a single table, whereas designer flows can be triggered by, as we talked about earlier, multiple events, and that number of events keeps expanding, and they have different ways to be triggered. Business rules typically are going to run the same script every time they're triggered. You build the business rule, you write the script, you give it a condition, and when it reaches that condition, it triggers that script, and it's one script contained within the script field. On a designer flow, you have the ability to create a series of activities, just like in Workflow Editor, that are all triggered initially, and then they're triggered sequentially by each other in a linear fashion. So you can accomplish a lot more from a workflow or from a designer flow than you could from a business rule. But it's got the flexibility of a business rule in that you can attach it to table CRUD operations. And then the last two are reacting to form changes and not interacting directly with each other without some form of complex scripting, and then requiring JavaScript coding for just about anything beyond a basic update to a record or a field change. Where in designer flows, the intention is that you can do a lot of the same activities without needing the complex coding. The activities do that work for you. So either they can be coded ahead of time by a group of developers, and then admins or scoped app owners or things like that could use those flows, or there's a lot of out-of-the-box functionality that does that work for you. And then that goes back to the reusable actions that can be used in a pro code capacity, but with the caveat that for any major scripting, you would need an integration hub. But from the no code perspective, Flow Designer has a lot of options there. So if you've been in ServiceNow a while, you've collected quite a base of scripts and workflows. If you're like I was as a customer, you are constantly being asked by the business to innovate and implement new features with little attention given to improving the old ones. Here are a few low overhead items that potentially could be a quick win for your organization if transitioned into Flow Designer. So we'll start with simple workflows. When I say simple workflow, that goes back to that slide by ServiceNow that said, do you have very simple linear flows that have if-then statements in them? So anything that's just an approval or a few approvals followed by a task or several tasks that may be done in sequence, that falls to me in the category of simple workflow and could be a good candidate. An example here is one I just threw together that is a side-by-side of a Flow Designer version of a workflow that just has a manager approval and a task and then closes out. You could recreate the same thing because it's very linear. You're just doing, if it's this state, go here. If it's not, go here. Wait for certain states to apply on the task. Depending on the states, go one way or the other. You'll notice here that this checks for 3 different states. That's where it could get a little bit more complicated in Flow Designer, because you see it's basically, is it this or is it this? If you had 4 or 5 options, you may not be able to easily branch that flow. So these are obvious use cases where you could put them into Flow Designer. So why would you put it into Flow Designer? That's really up to your company's needs. But I would make the case for considering what we talked about earlier, which is the logging and maintaining all of your code base in one central hub. I'm sure a lot of you have tried to troubleshoot workflows in the past, especially in production, where you're going to the script logs, or it might be the error might have showed up on the workflow, or you might have just an activity state on the workflow and you have to decide from that, did it trigger properly? There's 3 or 4 different ways that we know out of experience to go troubleshoot a workflow. With a Flow Designer, you would be able to go into the executions list that was on the previous slide, pull that up, show the previous executions of the flow, and then find each step and where the variables were set and what errors occurred and that kind of thing. So it does help a lot with troubleshooting the code base and just having it all in one place. Next on the list is asynchronous business rules. Well, I don't think I could say with all honesty that a Flow Designer is right to replace every kind of business rule. I do think asynchronous business rules are a very good candidate for this. Flow Designer has some struggle with the idea of a condition that triggers and the flow triggers, and then let's say you have a task that has to be completed within that flow before the next activity triggers. If you have a task that needs to be completed, it didn't get completed, but let's say the flow triggers on an update of incident, and that incident gets updated again, then the next flow triggers. You may not know right where in the process that flow, that previous flow is, and even if you could just cancel that flow, it might stop in the middle of a task that's being generated or something like that. And then the next flow would trigger and you'd have 2 flows on top of each other, possibly one that's canceled or you have them running simultaneously. It can get messy quickly if you're not careful with your triggers and how you're designing the flows and what you're designing into the flows. Asynchronous business rules are a quick win because that's how they're designed to work anyway. They're just there to be triggered, run, and then complete in the background. And Flow Designer is perfect for that because that's where it shines. As you trigger it, you set up all of your activities in a line, they all trigger in a row. They trigger without any monitoring or anybody needing to watch them. And then when they're done, they're done, and you have your list of executions to look back and see what happened. So one good example of this is just a very simple asynchronous business rule that goes from the incident, whenever an incident is created, and writes a comment to the related CI. You can see here, it's just a quick script that I threw together in the asynchronous business rule. When it runs, I could put a log statement in here to log it to the script log. Alternatively, I could just put this in here where I have an out-of-the-box action that already exists for adding a comment, and I'm able to retrieve the incident from this previous step and just write to the comments on that incident. No code involved. It's going to write to the executions table and show me what happened in the background. It's just going to run on its own, and it's very quick to do. So this might be a good case for consolidating at least your asynchronous activities into Flow Designer and then keeping some of your other things in business rules. We've also got simple catalog item workflows. The main difference here, as you're probably aware, is that catalog items function a little bit differently, because when you submit a catalog item, there's a lot of stuff that has to happen in the background to generate the request item, the request, and the task. It's not a one-to-one. So with some recent updates to Flow Designer, it is now possible to take a catalog item, and instead of specifying a workflow, you can select a flow to run off of it instead, and that to be the primary triggered flow. And then on the rhythm that's generated, there is usually a show workflow button or link, and that link now goes out to Flow Designer if you've assigned a flow to it. With that functionality, you could do similar to what we talked about with simple workflows. You could do very simple steps or very common types of catalog items using Flow Designer and keep all of those in the same place. And then I always go back to what I think is the main benefit of Flow Designer over other features, which is the ability to maintain your code in one place, the ability to distribute that code to people who aren't necessarily developers, or who may be part of the business if they have a scoped application or something where they need to run a workflow. And you can hand that packaged code off, and they would be able to use that to build their own catalog items. So this is just a simple example from the out-of-the-box ServiceNow instance of a catalog item. It's actually a record producer, and you see here that it's pointing to the outage table and has a note that says create a new incident as a different item. So in cases like this where you might normally just want a quick record producer to throw something out there, but it points to one table, you could very easily just say, all right, well, this is a simple flow. I'm going to ask a few questions up at the front end to decide for the user, is this actually an incident or is it actually an outage? And then have the workflow branch a little bit and decide, all right, we're going to create this type of record versus this type of record, or we're going to change the results a little bit, the tasks that are generated. Some of that you can do with Workflow Editor, and often this would be resolved with either an order guide or multiple record producers, but it isn't a simple type of task that could be done using Flow Designer in lieu of Workflow Editor, if you're looking for things that you could easily transition without too much overhead. And then lastly, we have reusable actions. Every company has its list of activities that are performed across the business over and over and over. Reusable actions offer a way to codify that work into a library that can be distributed depending on the structure of your ServiceNow environment, to either to your administrators, your app owners, or even to power users in some cases. And this allows you to manage a single code base with security while providing flexibility. On top of that, ServiceNow actually offers an ever-expanding base of out-of-the-box actions spanning across the majority of the various product suites. So in this case, I just have one example of the ITSM suite, where you can see a lot of these activities were already predefined. But up beyond that, you have the ability to create new ones, where you could generate your own custom activities to do whatever's relevant to your company, that maybe you want to put together an action for a set of actions for the company, and then have those be available to be used in any of the flows around the company, including by teams that aren't necessarily yours, and you can still handle that code base. Taking advantage of these transition opportunities, these four that we mentioned, is a great way to start consolidating your code base. With those use cases in mind, I'm going to hand it over to David, who's going to go over some types of activity that probably make more sense to leave in Workflow Editor.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. All that was excellent information. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about those, right? We have 4 examples, but the things that we think would be a little bit more difficult to put into Flow Designer, not impossible, we'll talk about that a little bit, but a little bit more difficult to put into Flow Designer, and may still fit better in the Workflow Editor. So yeah, so I'll go through these. So each one of these is going to have its own slide where I have an example that I built as well. So we'll start with multipath. In multipath, we're basically talking about workflows that could follow one of many paths, right? So typically this would be like a switch activity where you have a variable that has, or a field that has a ton of values to choose from, where you can technically do that in Flow Designer, but you're talking about possibly extremely nesting if-then statements, or really large if-then statements that really make the Flow Designer. It sort of takes away the whole purpose of the Flow Designer being simple and easy to read and easy to use. So I have a very simple example here that I've created that only has 2 options for the switch statement. But as you can see, if we had a variable that had like 30 options, I could very easily just slide that switch activity into this flow, and it's automatically going to build all of those different pathways for me, and I just have to connect them. So something that we think is a bit easier to do still in the workflow editor, but not impossible to do in Flow Designer, is this switch statement. Again, very, very simple example. The next one we'll look at is non-linear workflows, right? So these are workflows that typically would involve some sort of rollback. So some decision is made during the workflow, and for whatever reason, we have to go back to some task or some code prior to, right? And so in this little example that I've created, we have a task that has 2 pathways. It could either be complete, closed complete, or closed incomplete. So if for whatever reason the fulfiller sets this task to incomplete, we can then move it on to create it doesn't say it, but that's actually an incident that's being created. So it creates a task that tells the team that there's an issue with why this task couldn't be fulfilled. And then then it rolls back up to that task after that incident is sorted out, after everything is resolved. And so there's no real good way to do this in Flow Designer, to do the rollback, because Flow Designer is it's designed really in a linear way. Not it doesn't branch off a whole lot. It's you go up and down throughout the Flow Designer. So this might be one of those ones that you would keep in Flow. Again, all of these that I'm going over here can be packaged as subflows that you call within the Flow Designer. So all of these could still be part of the bigger picture. Okay, so the next one we'll talk about is recursion or recursive workflows. So I've actually used this quite a bit. These are tasks that are, it's a flow that may iterate over some item or some array of items. However that gets passed into the flow. I use this pretty often to cut down on, I guess, sprawl that you would get in the workflow editor. Now, we want to talk about that for a second, because there is a looping construct within the Flow Designer. But caveat here with code. So Flow Designer was built and with in mind that it was going to be a no-code solution, right? So you can use code in Flow Designer, but it's not Flow Designer. It's actually Integration Hub. So you have to have Integration Hub to actually build a custom script and run a custom script within Flow Designer. So if you don't have that, or if that's not in the books for you, or in the future for you, then if you have to run a script of any sort, you're going to run that here in the workflow editor. So in this example, I'm passing in a list of or it's a variable with a list of items. So it may be a list collector. It may actually be a string or an array of strings that I'm passing in. And then we run a little script to see if there's an item or if there's a next item in this array, right? Or I'm sorry, the first one says, does the array actually contain items? Because if it doesn't contain items, we're just going to push it on down and end it. If it does contain items, we're going to go to the first one or to the next one. We're going to process that item. In this case, we are doing a catalog task. But this may be the processing of a script. It doesn't have to be a catalog task. And then after that, we're going to remove that item from the array and then see if it has more items. And if it does, we go all the way back through again. So this is the recursion that we were talking about, right? So no outside of the loop piece that is in Flow Designer, there's no real good way to do recursion. And in this case, we're actually using a script to, where the catalog task is, where it's processing the item. Let's assume there's a script in there that's dynamically moving on to the next step, right? So it's something that we're calculating as we go through this recursion. So if it has more items, it goes back up, it recurses through, goes to the next item in the array and goes through all that again. If it does not have more items, it ends. And again, there's a good candidate for a subflow to be called within Flow Designer. Okay, that's recursion. And then lastly, we have one called multitask. And so multitask flows, these aren't official names, but multitask flows are those that branch off and join back together. So yeah, here's the example. So with this one, we have a branch, we branch off into multiple tasks. And then, if it didn't matter whether those tasks were completed before we moved on, then it'd be no big deal. We could do that in Flow Designer. But because we need to wait for both of these to complete before joining back and then moving on, there's no real good way to do that within Flow Designer. And so the branch/join construct that we have here in the workflow editor is a good candidate to keep in the workflow editor. So yep, I think that covers it. We can move on. I think that's it for the 4 examples that I had. I think we're now at the Q&A section.
Awesome. Yeah. So I definitely have seen some questions rolling in. So we'll get to those. Okay. First question. Does Flow Designer work with scoped apps and delegated development?
So the answer to that is yes. And actually you can see that in play in the event management module where event management now handles a lot of their assignment rules or their alert rules using Flow Designer, and the Flow Designer flows are within the event management scope. So you can actually delegate out access to event management, and your event team can manage the flows within Flow Designer. They can edit, they can create new ones in some cases, depending on how you set the permissions, and they could do that all within that scope.
Great. And then it looks like there was another question. Can you code in the Flow Designer?
Yes. You want to take that one, David?
Yeah, sure. I touched up on that very briefly in my portion of the presentation, but yeah, you can code. So there's 2 constructs for coding, right? So you can create functions within the data pills for fields. So let's say we want to transform a field value from something to a sys ID or something like that. So we can build small scripts within those functions, and that's part of the Flow Designer. That comes with Flow Designer. But if you want to run a script independent of that data and just as a script activity and create a reusable script activity, then that's part of Integration Hub and not part of the base Flow Designer tool.
Awesome. Here's another one. Can you check out and modify Flow Designer flows in prod? I know this is an issue with workflow.
That's always a tricky thing to answer anyway, because it's not terribly good idea to check out that kind of thing in production in general, just because you want to make sure that it works correctly. And so I would probably never recommend that in the first place. But I'm not 100% sure I'm pretty sure it wouldn't necessarily have an issue. You could check it out and then publish it, but that goes back to the code management. Do you want to potentially break something in production that you haven't been able to test in sub-production?
Right. The question then I think is added on about whether it should be done in prod or via update set, and I would say update set is the way to go.
Yeah. Yes, I would add to that as well that if you've ever done a flow In an update set, there are a lot of moving parts to it. It's not like Workflow Editor where you check it out and you publish it and it's one line in your update set. There's a whole piece of all the components get added in separate lines. So trying to do that without an update set could get really messy really fast.
Great. And here's another one. Could a flow be used to say add a reschedule action and seek reapproval of a change request?
I think if could be used as a subflow that gets generated based on specific conditions of that change, then I think that's definitely possible. Mm-hmm. But if it's one flow that we're talking about that's attached to the entire change, then that would be going back to the whole the part that I talked about before, where if we go back, we do a rollback, then it's really better suited outside of Flow Designer. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think the rollback would be the tricky part of that.
Right.
Yes. And then there was another question. When testing a flow, do we have a rollback feature like we do with ATFs?
Oh, so that's talking about the actual execution and testing, not actually in a flow. I don't believe there is a rollback. The testing is very simple though. You can retest very easily by throwing a new context into the Flow Designer. Hopefully that makes sense as well.
Awesome. We have lots of questions coming in. Is it possible to kill a flow that is either hung or stuck in a loop?
Actually, yes, I was playing around with this a little bit and was interested to find out that you can pretty much just outright cancel a flow, which is good in one sense, but then can also be a little tricky because if it's attached to something like a catalog item and your rhythm is dependent on the next task or whatever, and you kill it, it will kill the flow. So it's not coming back. It doesn't matter what triggers. But it does seem like it's much more flexible in that area where you could just click a button and say, stop this flow from running anymore, and it'll just stop.
So, and there's also a caveat to that too. So there is whenever I was dealing with a Flow Designer flow prior to New York, I had the need to cancel a flow based on a condition, and I couldn't because there was no out of the box code for that yet. That came out with New York. There's now a flow API and a cancel function that's part of that API that you can call in code as well, if you have to.
Awesome. And for those of you asking, this webinar will be recorded and it will be put up onto YouTube and the GlideFast website for future reference as well. It'll be up there in a couple of days after it is edited. But I see a bunch of you asking that. Couple more questions. Here's a good one. Is it safe to say workflow is best for change over Flow Designer?
That comes down to an opinion. I mean, based on what we've shown, it's kind of up to your organization to decide. I don't think I want to put myself on the chopping block there, but I would say that if your change is dependent on things like rollback, you're probably going to lean towards Workflow Editor.
Which it is out of the box. I believe it has a rollback in it, right?
Yeah. But then again, we've also shown that you can actually attach those workflows to a Flow Designer flow. So it's really just how you decide to implement.
Great. Here's another one. Regarding transitioning, are you aware of any cost or benefit examples of transitioning? Is there any automated means to do so?
I'm not aware of any automated means. That's probably a question best asked your account rep. But as far as I'm aware, you're pretty much just, they're not planning on phasing out Workflow Editor anytime soon. And if they did, I'm pretty sure there would be an automated means because that wouldn't go well for a lot of companies. But for the time being, that's kind of why we went over the suggested types to transition. It gives you an easy way to start that process if you're interested without needing to dedicate a project to that process.
Yeah, and I think the part of the question about cost benefit is, what we were trying to convey at the beginning of this session was that if you have time that you're devoting and putting into building those actions at the beginning of your transition, and those actions are well-defined and things that you can pass on to folks that aren't necessarily developers, but are people that are going to do no-code development of flows, then I think you do end up gaining cost benefits in the long run because you've built those, and now you can have multiple people that aren't developers that may be business owners that can actually go in and create these flows for themselves. because those actions, you've put the time in to create those actions on the front end of everything.
Awesome. Let's do 2 more questions. Can you use Flow with integrations without the purchase of Integration Hub, like custom built REST integrations?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I don't think that's possible.
No, because you have an actual REST activity type that comes with Integration Hub that does not come out of the box with Flow Designer. So hopefully that answers it.
Awesome. Yep. And let's do 1 more question. Is there a migration path from Workflow to Flow Designer?
One that we can decide for you? Probably not without knowing your organization.
Right.
But I think that's really why we brought these 4 transition types to the forefront, because I think you could start there. And that's really all we could tell you from this presentation is here's a good place to start. And then as you're looking at what you have in your environment, what you're trying to do with your current flows, with your business rules, you can establish what things would make sense to move and then start building your transition path. But I think I'm pretty confident that what we've shown you is a good place to start.
All right. Well, for anyone that has more questions, feel free to definitely reach out to Matt or David. Their emails are their first last name at glidefast.com, or you can reach out at info@glidefast.com, and we'd be more than willing to answer any of these questions that you guys have. And it will be recorded and shared on YouTube and our website. But now I would like to announce the winner of our $50 Visa gift card giveaway. And it looks like the winner is Harry Tillman. Congratulations, Harry. Your prize will be emailed to you directly to the email that you signed up for this webinar with. All right, everyone. Thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed it and learned some useful information. If you still have any more questions, feel free to reach out to the GlideFast team and sign up for more webinars at glidefast.com/GlideFast on air. Thank you.